All right, we're in part 2 now. We're picking up where we left off. So Matthew 24 is where we're at, verse 4. So we just ended on the apostles or the disciples asking Jesus in verse 3, "Tell us, when will these things be, and what will be the sign of your coming and the close of the age?" And I talked about how these things were linked to the destruction of the temple and how that was linked to the judgment or the imprecatory words Jesus said to the scribes and Pharisees. And what generation was that? It was the generation Jesus was speaking to. So, then we talked about how comings happen multiple times in Scripture. Just to give you an example, with Egypt in, I believe, Isaiah chapter 19, verse 1, the coming of the Lord in the clouds. He didn't actually literally surf in on clouds and judge Egypt, but that's the dramatic prophetic language God uses when he is going to judge a nation. And so there are multiple comings. I believe the first coming was when he came in judgment, the first coming of Christ when he came in judgment on the first temple. Second temple, his second coming would be AD 70. And then the final coming of Christ, we are waiting for that. And until that final coming, there are many comings of Christ when he judges nations. Part of the judgments, again, are also vindications of those who are being oppressed. Now, some people will say the first coming of Christ was the incarnation. Like I said, typically comings have to deal with judgments. So, then the last point, the close of the age. Well, what age are we talking about? If you have no more temple, if that's to be done away with, then the disciples would have understood there is no more old covenant age. There's something new. There's, in a sense, a new heavens and earth to look forward to. And so here we are now, verse 4. And so Jesus answered them, "See that no one leads you astray. For many will come in my name, saying, 'I am the Christ,' and they will lead many astray. And you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not alarmed, for this must take place. But the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All these are the beginnings, or the beginning of the birth pains." So, a lot there. Let's talk about, for starts, these false Christs that are showing up. Now, Jesus, in his day, there were many others who claimed to be the Messiah. What would the Messiah do? He would draw the nations to Yahweh. That's talked about all throughout the Old Testament. Many of the Jews, there was a fervor to see the Messiah bring this about. And, of course, the way Jesus brings this about is slowly, like a mustard seed. It starts out small and grows into a big tree, a little bit of leaven and dough, and eventually it spreads. But they were anticipating a Messiah that would bring some political imperial rule, if you will, of the Jewish faith to all the nations. Many of the fanatics or the zealots or the Sicarii would try to bring that about through might. Daniel's prophecy, there was a 490-year timeline from Cyrus's decree to Christ's day, which I'm not going to go into all that, but people were anticipating a Messiah. And some people, either being compelled by demons or just prideful or what, they claimed to be somebody. You can look in Acts, I believe, chapter 5, the chapter where the apostles say we must obey God rather than men. Gamaliel, part of the council, he says, look, let's stop beating these guys. If they're of God, if they're of Yahweh, then their mission will come about. But if they aren't, then they'll end up like Theudas and Judas, who both claim to be somebody. And what he was talking about were false Christs, okay? You've got Josephus's work, Antiquities. I think it's Antiquities 18. where he talks about several different false Christs, messiahs, kind of in that BC, first century AD era that were springing up. And then the book of Acts, you can see all these false prophets that are showing up. And so there is a fervor in the cosmos for the Messiah to come, do his mission, atone for our iniquities, and then go sit at the right hand of God and rule the heavens and earth and bring about his kingdom and get his law throughout the lands. But there were counterfeit Christs trying to establish their movements. And so Jesus is warning of these false Christs. And then in verse 6, we hear of wars and rumors of wars. Now the Pax Romana, peace of Rome, was going on. And so the Romans and the Jews overall had a pretty good relationship. When you look in the history of the Maccabean brothers, with the Maccabean revolt, when Antiochus IV, a Greek ruler who came up from Egypt, he ended up Hellenizing many of the Jews. And it seems after that, I can't remember off the top of my head, somewhere around the 160s BC, all the Hellenization, bringing Greek culture and religion and synthesizing that into the Jewish culture, it fractured the Jewish faith. You have the Sadducees, who ended up being quite liberal and only took the first 5 books of the Torah as God's word, and they have their distinctives. The Pharisees, who began, they tried to defend Jewish orthodoxy, many of them, but by the time Jesus' day came along, many of the Pharisees had embraced oral traditions. They just couldn't wait any longer for new revelation from God, and so Mishnah and Talmud are products of that. You've got the Essenes, who sort of checked out from the world, and that's why I think they're not really mentioned in the Bible, because they completely threw their hands up and sort of gave up trying to witness in the cities. And so there's other factions, the Herodians, with their political influence, etc. So wars going on, though. The Jews weren't thinking of that, because when they made an alliance with the Romans back in the Maccabean revolt, they had a brotherly confederacy between them. But slowly, over time, the Romans, who were supposed to act as the guardian beast of Israel, they ended up sort of going rabid, right, and started to try to get the Jews to compromise their faith. And eventually wars broke out between the Jews and the Romans. You can read also Tacitus and Suetonius's works on this, of many, many parts of the Roman Empire starting to fall into civil dispute. So verse 7, for nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famines and earthquakes in various places. Again, go read Suetonius and Tacitus. These are first century Roman historians, and they talk about famines, such bad famines all throughout Rome that Egypt was sort of plundered for their grain, and that they were the food source for many of the people in Europe, because the famines were so bad. The earthquakes, heck, right at Jesus' crucifixion, Matthew has recorded a giant earthquake that took place, and many, many other earthquakes, omens, strange things are also recorded in these Roman secular sources that are happening within the generation Jesus was speaking to. So that's interesting. Also, the book of Acts, under Claudius's rule, the emperor before Nero, he was dealing with famines, as the scriptures talk about as well. So Jesus' prophecies are coming to pass within the time indicators he gave, their generation. Otherwise, if there was no time indicators, when they asked Jesus, when will these things be, the sky would have been the limit. And so Jesus is telling them these are what are going to happen. These are as he says in verse 8, the beginning of the birth pains. What was the main birth of judgment that was hanging over their heads? The destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. And so, verse 9, moving forward, Jesus continues on, they then will deliver you up to tribulation, put you to death, and you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake. And then many will fall away and betray one another and hate one another. And many false prophets will arise and lead many astray. So, there again, the false prophets, that fervor of a Messiah coming. Demonic realm was extremely active too at this time. I'm sure they demonized and tried to convince people that maybe they themselves were a prophet, and the demons were showing themselves as angels of light. You see that in many movements in the Middle East, counterfeit Christian movements or counterfeit biblical movements. Just take Muhammad, for example. He had a vision, apparently from Gabriel, and this isn't anything new under the sun. God gives us a standard for testing prophets. Just because an angel comes to you in light, even Paul says in Galatians, don't accept their message if it's a false gospel, if it doesn't comport with what God's already revealed about himself and the kingdom and salvation prior. So, we know that many of the Christians in the first century did get persecuted for Christ's name's sake, Stephen being one of the first martyrs. And that would go on in waves. There were some spots of peace. I think there was about a 12-year time of peace for the Christians to kind of expand after that first wave of persecution upon them. But leading up to Nero, a wave of persecution hit them pretty hard for about 3.5 years, right before AD 70. So these things did happen within that generation. Verse 12, and because lawlessness will be increased, the love of many will grow cold. That's coldness of the heart is affiliated with Satan. If we are loving our neighbor, we have a warm heart by the warmth of the Spirit within us. And so many went cold. But, verse 13, the one who endures to the end will be saved. And this gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. What end are we talking about? Remember, the end or the close in verse 3 of the age. What age? The old covenant age was coming to a close. That wineskin was getting old, and the wine judgment, God's wrath upon the covenant-breaking Jews was about to come. They had all this knowledge, all this light of Yahweh. And so, yes, the Jews were a primary example of God's love and grace and mercy, but also they would become a primary example of God's wrath upon the wicked. And so, thankfully, though, Christ is giving a heads up. These are the things to come. Here's the signs. If you're heeding Christ's words, then people would be able to avoid the judgments that were going to happen. Now, of course, he does talk about some of the Christians would be martyred. As the saying goes, credited to Tertullian, 3rd century Christian apologist, the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. And so that would, with the blood of all these martyrs, lay a foundation for the church. And she has continued to grow, ebbs and flows, but the light has never gone out for the church. Amen. As the age has carried on. Now, the verse 14, when it says the gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the whole world as a testimony to all nations. Some people will say, well, a lot of people will say, well, that hasn't happened yet. The whole world hasn't gotten the whole gospel. Well, one, I would argue, how the heck are you going to calculate that? But two, the word here, it's unfortunate. I'm reading out of an ESV, and even, I guess, more modern translations that are trying to get more technical with the original languages, like the LSB. They have notes, but still they don't put inhabited world. The whole inhabited world is what the Greek is, not the whole cosmos or the whole world, in the sense that the gospel needs to, at this point in history, have traveled all the way to North America, South America, all the way to China, India, etc. That's not what's being said here. It's the oikumene, the inhabited world that they knew. I'll give you some extra biblical sources too. After this biblical source, Luke chapter 2, when it talks about the census that Caesar does, it says that he gave a census of the whole world, the whole inhabited world. Obviously, Caesar didn't take a census of North and South America and China and India. It was the whole inhabited world that they knew. So what would that have been? The Roman Empire, the political boundaries of Roman rule, everyone within that umbrella, that's the inhabited world. Beyond that were the barbarians or the unknown, okay? And this is how many of the ancients would have thought about that term, oikumene. So I'll give you an example. Josephus, in his book, Wars of the Jews, in Wars, he talks about how the temple, as glorious as it was, would receive tributes from the whole inhabited world, the oikumene. Obviously, people in North and South America, etc., were not sending tribute to the temple. But people, the nations within the umbrella of the Roman Empire that they knew, those nations would give tribute to the temple. Okay. Also, if you look at, I've got a book here, Strabo's work, geography of the ancient world that he does. He's actually got a map that was the main map in the ancient world for quite some time. But Strabo writes, okay, the territory and activities, this is in Geography 1.1.15. Okay, the territory and activities on the land and sea where we live is small when it is small and large when it is large, with the largest, the entirety that we specifically call the inhabited world, the location of our largest activities. So, the greatest commanders are those who are able to control both land and sea and bring together peoples and cities under single authority and political administration. So they would have called that the inhabited world. That would have been the Roman Empire. Anything beyond that would be where barbarians were, the non-civilized people, if you will, according to the Romans. So I think even this work, Cosmos's Christian Topography, I haven't looked at the Greek in there yet, but he also uses the inhabited world. And in his work, he talks about the things he's seen within the inhabited world. And beyond that, he does not know there are barbarians there, etc. So, that being said, I do believe the gospel did go throughout the whole inhabited world in the first century. Last thing I'll say, you can look at Romans 1:8 and Colossians 1:23, where Paul talks about, he's using, dramatic metaphoric language here, but he even says that the gospel had gone throughout the whole cosmos, the whole world. So obviously it didn't literally touch, every single person, but what he was getting at, it has breached Judea. It has now entered into the bloodstream of the whole world, the gospel. And that is exactly what Christ accomplished with the church by AD 70. The gospel had gone throughout the whole inhabited world. It was in the bloodstream of the cosmos, or the whole world. So, sorry to put a lot of time into that, but people get real caught up on this verse to understand or interpret all of it as being future, whereas I believe, no, this is dealing with events in the first century. So now let's roll into verse 15. So when you see the abomination of desolation spoken by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. So what I'll say to this is a tough passage for sure. Daniel chapter 9, 24 through 27 talks about an abomination of desolation, standing in the holy place. Now, this abomination of desolation, if you read the timeline of Daniel through his 70 weeks of 7, or 490 years is how that should be interpreted. At the end of this 490 years from Cyrus's decree, that is when we are seeing this abomination of desolation take place. So this is at the end of Jesus' ministry. He condemns the temple. It's a den of thieves. Who goes into that temple? Satan goes into the temple, of course. And so it's sort of Satan's Babylon, if you will. And God's going to judge it. Now, where was I going with this? When you see the abomination of desolation. Oh, yes. So I was going to say, if you read First Maccabees and the Maccabean author, or the author of Maccabees, when he writes that the abomination of desolation took place in the temple in the 2nd century BC, that's one of the reasons why I don't take that book as canon. It's a good book. You can sort of read it. It's got good history. But I wouldn't say that's canon in the sense of it's revelation from Yahweh. Because the author, I don't think he understood the timeline of Daniel, the 490 years, that the abomination of desolation would happen at the end of that. And so that's something to consider. So regardless, what helps is we'll find in Luke's account is instead of talking about the abomination of desolation that most Gentiles wouldn't have understand, let alone many Jews who would be following this tough theology here, Luke says, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, flee to the mountains. And that's what happened during the Jewish wars. The Romans circled around the Jews, and they actually pull back because there's a civil war going on in 69 AD, 68, 69 AD, and that's the moment where the Jews could flee Jerusalem to the mountains or up north and flee from that wrath. In fact, I talk about this in a bit of depth in one of my church history videos. It's the 1st century part 1 dealing with the Jews. Maybe I'll put a link in there. But if you go kind of more towards the end of the video, I do give some more background on the wars with the Jews in AD 70. Okay, so obviously, too, in verse 16, this is a local judgment in Judea. They're to flee to the mountains. This is not talking about people who live in the West or, I live in North Dakota, so where are we going to go? To the Turtle Mountains? No, this is clearly local. Remember, the generation Jesus was speaking to. Verse 17, let one who is on the housetop not go down to take what is in his house. And let the one who is in the field not turn back to take his cloak. And alas, for women who are pregnant and for those who are nursing infants in those days, pray that your flight may not be in winter or on the Sabbath. For then there will be great tribulation, such as has not been from the beginning of the world until now, nor will there ever be. So we'll pause there. Now, the urgency of this, Jesus is warning, once you see this abomination of desolation, or in Luke's account, Jerusalem surrounded by armies, flee to the mountains. Do not turn back for your things. In fact, if you read the book of Acts, there were many Christians selling their things because they knew a judgment was coming. So this isn't to, I don't believe them selling things is to support the belief that Christians need to be selling all their stuff and just giving it all to the poor. Of course, we should be giving to the poor, doing mercy ministries, etc., with the gleanings of what God's given us, and then some. But that doesn't at all, I don't believe the scriptures teach you need to just sell everything. Okay? The Christians were being strategic. You need means to bless people. If you don't have any means, then you know it's hard to do that. Of course, you can bless them with a good word or your labors, but okay. So they knew a judgment was coming, and hence the urgency here with what Jesus is saying. You don't want to be in labor on the Sabbath. I'm sure there's some more meaning behind that, but the point is it's going to be very difficult for even women who are pregnant in these days, having children in the middle of a war. This brutal, as it says in verse 23, or I'm sorry, verse 21, that this would be the great tribulation, such that has not been from the beginning of the world until now, nor will there ever be. Now, some people may argue, well, okay, if this happened in the first century, I'm following, and this happened to the Jews, but how do you explain all the Jews that were killed during the Holocaust? I mean, millions and millions. You can't tell me that this, in Matthew 24, dealing with the first century, was the greatest in the world, nor will there ever be. Afterwards, when you had all these Jews slaughtered in World War II, that make the numbers in the first century pale in comparison, I would submit that this is what the scriptures is telling us. This judgment that happened in the first century was the most fierce judgment to ever happen on a nation as there ever was or there ever will be. Think of it in national terms, okay? The God's covenant people receiving this kind of judgment as a covenant nation, this is the most fierce that's ever happened. And you can go read in quite graphic detail in Josephus's Wars and Eusebius's account as well of the kind of things that the Jews were doing to each other while they were under siege. In fact, I believe it was during, because they were under siege, the first wave, then Rome pulled back, but then that second wave, when Rome came in, the Jews were ending up, they didn't have enough food. They had just done a festival, so they had already, the city was swollen. They had eaten much of their food, and so that's the worst time to be celebrating a festival once you get hit right after that with a siege. And people were eating each other's children, ripping people's bellies open to get food. I mean, it was terrible stuff that happened. So I would say corporately, as God's covenant people that broke covenant and rebelled against him, that was the most violent, I should say, fierce judgment that had ever taken place on a nation. So, moving forward, verse 22, and if those days had not been cut short, no human being would be saved. But for the sake of the elect, those days were cut short. I think that's pretty straightforward. A little bit of predestination there. And then, if anyone says to you, verse 23, look, here is the Christ, and there he is, do not believe. For false Christs and false prophets will arise and perform great signs and wonders, so as to lead astray, if possible, even the elect. See, I have told you beforehand. Pause there. Where does this sound familiar? Where else in Scripture do we hear of signs and great wonders in the New Testament that God's people were to be watchful of, right? 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. This man of lawlessness who would come on the scene, and he would perform great signs and wonders. Now, I don't believe that is talking about a particular antichrist, but what it is talking about, I believe, is a high priest in the temple, a false high priest that performs signs and wonders. I'm not going to get into it in this video, all the details with that, but looking at, I believe it's Second Maccabees, kind of toward the beginning, there's talk about the fire in the temple and the miracle that God would work through the priest to relight that. You look in the book of Kings with Solomon and the fire of the Lord coming down to light the altar. Fire and mystery and signs and wonders are linked to God, temple, and the priests. Who was it? Is it Abihu and Nadab and Abihu, if I'm saying their names right? The two brothers that tried to burn strange incense before the Lord, and then the fire of the Lord consumed them. So, fire, signs, wonders, Yahweh, there is a connection there, and the temple. And so, false Christs, false prophets as well, performing these great wonders of, pseudo healings. You've got all sorts of hydromancy or divination and things that were going on in the book of Acts. So don't be fooled. This is Deuteronomy 101. If they give signs and wonders, lead you after a false god, or if they say the name of Yahweh and they start leading you after, false teachings and things, no, you're to reject them. Verse 26. So if they say to you, look, he is in the wilderness, do not go out. If they say, look, he is in the inner rooms, do not believe it. So where's the wilderness? That's outside of the city. John the Baptist, he was out in the wilderness. So that was a place where prophets would show up. I mean, look at Muhammad. He was out in the wilderness when he got his supposed revelation. So it was known that when, a special man would go out in the wilderness, he would come into contact either with Yahweh or with demons. And so Jesus is saying, be careful. Now, the inner rooms. What is the inner rooms? That would be the temple, the sanctuary. These leaders in the temple function prophetically as well. And so if they're giving teachings that are corrupting the teachings of Yahweh, their oral traditions, their poisonous waters, you're to reject that. And so, moving on, we'll finish up here with this part. Verse 27, for as the lightning comes from the east and shines as far as the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. Wherever the corpse is, there the vultures will gather. So, of course, corpse, that would be Jerusalem under judgment, and all the blood that was pouring out of the sanctuary, it would have been flowing out of the sanctuary. If you read Josephus's account of what happened, the amount of bloodshed that happened in the city, self-inflicted from the Jews going under a delusion, attacking each other, and then also from the Romans coming in. Now, as far as the lightning metaphor is, that's not talking about a big bolt of light that would go from, North America all the way around the globe back to North America, and everyone would see Jesus coming in the clouds type of thing. This kind of judgment is still local. When you look at a lightning storm, it's a local storm. You see it shoot across the sky. That doesn't mean it's going across from, I'm in North Dakota, from North Dakota all the way over to like China or something. No, it's still local. So this is an indicator here still of a local judgment, and that no one's going to miss it. Everyone sees lightning locally, right? The flash, everyone sees that. And so no one was going to miss, this is what Jesus was talking about once AD 70 rolled in. Without a doubt, these are the things Jesus said, and it's happening live, right before our eyes. All right. I think from here, you know what? Let's just keep going. Let's just keep going. No, we'll stop. We'll make it another video. So we'll catch you in the next video. Thanks for watching. God bless.